shift gears into assessment skills. If you look at the EdTPA handbook, you'll see that there are 5 more rubrics, and these are all assessment rubrics. The first one is, can you analyze student learning? Level 3, again, is basically where you're supposed to be. And what you need to do here is that you need to analyze student achievement of goals, and you focus on what was right and what was wrong. That is a must. Level 2, you just look at what they did wrong, or you just look at what they did right. And analysis includes some differences in whole class learning, meaning that you are able to distinguish between the different students you are focused on. When you get up to level 4 and 5, you are getting to the idea that you are finding quantitative and qualitative patterns of learning for individuals or groups. Quantitative patterns are just the differences in meeting different objectives, and the qualitative is the more interesting thing about why didn't people meet an objective. So that's the first one, analysis of student learning. Second thing, providing feedback. Feedback needs to be specific, needs to be aligned with your objectives, and needs to focus on either the strengths or the weaknesses, or they call them needs. Now, in this case, again, in the first one, you need to focus on both. In this one, you just need to talk about one, or your feedback just needs to be directed at one. Again, if you look at a 4, all you have to do is have your feedback focused on the strengths and needs, and you're automatically in a 4. Super easy to do. Level 5, you are also providing a strategy for individual learning needs, or you are tying in prior learning or experience to improve learning in your feedback. Again, something that's very doable. 13 is student understanding and use of feedback. What you're supposed to do here is basically tell them how are you going to get students to, 1, understand your feedback, and 2, actually use it. It needs to be tied to the learning objectives again. When we get to 4 or 5, you are basically giving a plan for how you're going to create space for students to actually use the feedback to improve their skills and move forward. Look at rubric 14. It's analyzing students' language use. And so here, where you identify different language demands in your lesson plan, now you're giving evidence that people actually met or got around those language demands. And so you'll demonstrate them doing the language function, which is something that should be done anyway. It's the major point of your lesson. And you need to make sure you identify any vocab, syntax, or discourse. A level 5, again, candidate explains and provides evidence of language use and content learning for students with varied needs. So basically, I am showing how I got different people at different levels, right, of needing supports or extensions to actually meet these language demands. Finally, 15, using assessment to inform instruction. Based on your analysis that you did earlier on, what are you going to do now going forward? Tying this to research and theory. To get to a level 5, next steps provide targeted support to individuals and groups to improve their learning relative to, again, back to the lesson plan, the essential strategy and those related skills, right? The major lesson goal and the sub-goals. That's how you read that. And the next steps that you're going to take are justified with research and theory. So that brings us back to teacher skills. We're going to talk about these different skills that were included in those rubrics, right? The analysis, the finding the learning patterns, both quantitative and qualitative, giving feedback to students, empowering students to use it, showing evidence of language use, using data, and supporting decisions with research. When we think about analysis of student learning, to take the first skill, it's basically identifying the amount of learning that took place for each objective. How you do this is you use pre-tests and post-tests to measure the growth. If you don't give a pre-test, you can't really give any evidence of what people actually learned, because they may have already known everything that you taught by the time you started class. Things to think about: this requires extra planning and making sure that you have a pre-assessment or some way of understanding what your students are coming to the table with in terms of academic skills. Now, you are encouraged to use either a graph or a table. You can use both. If you look at the perfect EdTPA, you'll see that they use both. This is just a simple graph of the average pre-assessment score and the average post-assessment score. If we look at what the analysis of learning in the perfect EdTPA looks like, we'll find that the analysis has a couple things. One, it goes item by item in the assessment. Two, it aligns each one of those items with a given objective or learning target. And then three, it describes what happened between the pre-test and the post-test. So for example, question 1 data for the pre-assessment shows that 7 of 29 students are not at the standard. 17 are approaching, 3 are meeting, right? And again, this is for learning target 1, tying those two things together. Meeting standard in question 1. Now I'm defining my standard, another really good idea to make sure that, again, the person scoring your work does not have to do extra tasks and take more time to figure things out. So meeting the standard in question 1 meant that students could define power in their own words and explain that power comes from many different places. Question 1 post-assessment data shows 0 students not at standard, so big improvement, 20 approaching, not everybody, and 9 meeting, another nice improvement. And then I do that same thing for every item on my pre-assessment. Seems pretty boring, right? Boring to write, but it shows that you know how to be thorough, how you have an assessment pre and post that's aligned with your objectives, and you go through item by item talking about the improvement. This person also provides a table, right? Pre-assessment, post, percentages, different learning targets. Brilliant. Makes it so easy for the person to follow. And as far as analysis of student learning goes, that's what it involves. Going through assessment data item by item, relating it to learning targets, and saying what happened. Second step then, finding patterns. Well, what is it? Identifying quantitative and qualitative patterns in your assessment data that directs your next steps. And this is going to happen way later on in the last part of the assessment portion. So how you do it? Quantitative patterns really is just a breakdown of the pre and post changes according to the objectives for student performance, kind of like the analysis thing. The qualitative patterns, though, are the whole why things are happening. Basically, it's a diagnosis that you're making about the problems that students have with any particular objective. So if you have high blood pressure, for example, it could be because you have genetic problems or predispositions. You could smoke, you could have high stress, you could have a poor diet, you might not exercise, or it could be any combination of those things, right? When you go to a doctor, the doctor's treatment for you will depend on what the causes are. Likewise, what you're trying to set yourself up for is to say that my next steps will be targeting the reasons why my students aren't succeeding. So as far as patterns go then, right, some examples again from the perfect EdTPA. As stated in 1B, of the 29 students in the class, 20 were approaching the standard in this portion of learning target 1 on the post-assessment. Whole class, now here's a whole class pattern, suggests that students were capable of defining power, but that most students restated the definition of power as it is outlined in their unit vocabulary chart. In other words, they were supposed to be able to describe it in their own words, and they weren't. And this is what 20 of her 29 students were doing. So something was going on there, and this actually might be a language demand issue about not understanding what she was asking them to do. So that would have to actually be addressed. Going on, second thing, use concrete examples. So you would say, like, for example, student 1, an ELL student, and focus student 3, a gifted learner, both demonstrated this common error made by the 20 students approaching the standard. Wow. Sounds boring again in the way that it's being written, but it's so clear. It follows such a easy pattern, or I should say structure, that leaves no doubt in my mind what you're talking about. The restatement of the question or the definition is demonstrated on question 1 of student work sample 3, ... and so on. Giving concrete examples. Finding patterns, more examples. Whole class patterns, again, suggest that most students substantially increase their ability to explain who has power in the text by using examples and academic vocabulary in their explanations in the post-assessment. Focus student 1 and 3 demonstrate this ability to explain who has power and how other characters respond to power by using applicable unit vocabulary in question 2. Here's another concrete example then. Student work sample 1 states, I think that Bailey has emotional power because ... One area where other students continue to struggle was using specific academic language to explain power. Another example here, and so on. One final example. Talking about misconceptions, although actually I don't like your use of the word misconception here. I don't think it's correct, but it doesn't really matter. They seem to like it. Another common misconception in the whole class student response for question 1 is shown in student work sample 2. The student correctly stated the definition of power in her own words, but she did not provide additional elaboration or examples of power to support her ideas. Of all students that scored at level 2 out of 3 on question 1, these were common misconceptions. Another common error among students who were approaching standard was a lack of analysis to support their evidence about character power. So again, you're looking at all the data and you're trying to figure out, well, what's going on here? Why aren't my students succeeding? And if they are, what are they doing right? Right? So that's what finding pattern is about. Now that pattern or those patterns leads to the type of feedback that you would give students. Now in the EdTPA and best assessment practices, feedback is information that you give to the students that they can use to move forward in their knowledge, skills, and abilities. How you do it? Well, 1, you align your feedback according to your objectives. 2, you give them a path forward. And 3, you talk about all the objectives, the things that they were good at and the things they weren't that good at. Things to think about then is that this is similar to the instructional skill deepening student knowledge, and that you are meeting the student where they are and guiding them forward. And again, when we think back about that instructional skill deepening student knowledge, it didn't matter if the students had exceeded, met, or were struggling to meet the standard. You were always trying to take them to the next step. And so here's an example of some bad feedback, right? Comments like excellent work that then don't tell what was good about the work are problematic. There are some vague comments in here, some mystery things. One thing here or there, remember punctuation and so on. And so even though the student did well, I really don't know what the objectives were. I don't know what I did well. I don't know how I could make it better, right? So this actually isn't very good feedback. If we look at this one, right, there's -3. I have no idea why. There are some little things about indenting, right? And then you have this strange cryptic information at the end, right? Where at first it says have more detail, and then you did a nice job adding lots of detail. That seems to be sending mixed messages, right? And again, this is actual student work that was given back to students. A better example is something like this, where you have specific skills rated and comments, right? And you can read this. But basically, the idea is that you talk about things that were good, things that still need to work on, and you give an opportunity for the student to actually use this stuff. Another example is like this, and actually if I had time and we were meeting in class, I typically share some more of the feedback where the student was writing a few inappropriate things in their work. It was kind of funny what the teacher wrote back. But this gives the same idea again. And one of the things that this addresses is, what do you do when there's not a lot of good things to talk about if you're supposed to look at and comment on the good and the bad? Thanks for the essay. There's a lot of good stuff in here. It's pretty vague, right? I've used that myself sometimes. But then he gets in a little more detail, right? And then there's some opportunity to use this feedback. One more example, and this is from the perfect EdTPA thing again. You have questions with learning targets and standards. You have specific feedback and a path forward on each one. And it allows the student, right, to know what they did right or wrong in each case. And if it's tied to the learning target, it's easy to tie to that particular skill. So keep that in mind as you go through, right? Align with your goals or objectives. Give a path forward to get better, no matter if they're already at the standard, past the standard, or haven't met the standard. And focus on everything, not just what they did wrong. The next skill then is empowering students to use feedback. And we think about what this is, right? It's enabling your students to use the feedback and providing a space and opportunity or incentive to actually have that happen. Now, how you do this is you build it into your assignments and your class activities or allocations, right, where you have either multiple assignments that they need to use the feedback from assignment 1 to do better on assignment 2 and to do better on assignment 3, kind of what we're actually doing in this class for some things, because it's all leading up to the final, and that's where you kind of have to do it on your own. I can offer extra credit. I can teach across curriculums. I can require corrections, or I can provide extra points for corrections, and so on. Now, things to think about here in the real world. If you're not careful, you can get out of control really fast. And the problem here is that your time gets taken up by trying to track consistently changing student work and having to provide additional feedback for revisions and so on. Examples of this can be found here. Again, this idea of maybe meeting after school sometime. This is what I want you to think about. This is what I want you to work on. In the case of the perfect EdTPA, the teacher gives this nice feedback. Aside from that item by item feedback, there's the summary feedback. And then the teacher requires the students to respond to their feedback. In other words, how are you going to use this? Tell me. And you make it a requirement. Again, this takes a lot of time. This is not sustainable if you teach 5 sections of 30 students every day. You just can't do it. So you'd have to think about when this is appropriate and how you can make it faster. Sample from that is that in my feedback and student work samples 1, 2, and 3, I ask students, based on my feedback, what are some things you might continue to work on as you read your social issues book? What are some things that you will continue to work on after this unit and during reading in general? Think about your resources. With this question, I guided students to set goals for this unit and to generalize their self-assessed strengths and weaknesses to future text responses. I mean, this is really actually brilliant for the EdTPA, and it's a great thing to do as a teacher, but it's really time intensive. Next skill, showing evidence of language use. Again, the idea here is that we have those different language demands about function, vocab, syntax, and discourse. And this is providing evidence that actually students are doing it. And again, if you don't do well in the first part and that 4th rubric in planning, you're not going to do well here. And for a while, this was the lowest scored one, like year after year. But it's gotten better. How you do it, you identify either video, audio, or written evidence that students were actually successfully using the primary language function, vocab, syntax, and so on. I see a typo there that I never noticed before. How about that? There we go. See me edit in real time. In this course, you add a lot of additional audio and video clips to make your case, and if there's not enough evidence in the written samples alone, you're allowed a certain amount. Everything you identify for rubric 4 in planning, you need to talk about here. So this is kind of like if you don't do a good job early, you're going to have a hard time scoring well here, so make sure you think carefully about that earlier on. So when we talk about what this might look like, this is, again, an example from the perfect EdTPA. So students demonstrate interactions with the language function apply on student self-reflections, Part E in Task 3. On the Power Exit Tickets 1 through 3 from Student Self-Reflections, I asked students to name one strategy that they applied to their reading that helped them think deeply about the text. Students demonstrated metacognitive awareness by aligning their responses to the language function apply of the central focus on exit tickets. Again, now concrete example. For example, Student Self-Reflection 2 for Exit Ticket Day 2 states, one strategy that I looked for in the text were allies, bystanders, and victims. Doing this, I found that these characters also had power. I could also figure out that they are important characters and will come up later in the text. Additional examples, right? Students demonstrate their practice with the unit vocabulary and student language use video submitted in Task 3. So again, this is them actually using some of the video, some of the vocab in a video. Again, using concrete examples, direct student quotes. I think they have physical power actually. Again, there's physical power, but they don't actually go around like pushing people. But whenever they are like involved in something, they might have physical power, but then when they are not involved in something, they might have social power. So now they're thinking about how power is different in different ways. And some of these were the language demands that this person identified earlier on. Finally, using data to guide your decision and backing it up with theory. What is this? Right, looking at all that assessment data, all those patterns, how you're getting kids to use the feedback, and then creating a plan for how you will move these kids forward or how you would change it better for next time. Some things to think about. Justifying your decisions with research and theory is an important skill, and it is the same thing that was described in planning and actually in instructional skills. Make sure that every recommendation that you make, you have a corresponding theory or theorist to go with it. So here's some examples, right? Based on my analysis of student learning, some instructional next steps for the whole class will include 1, supporting students to improve their learning relative to learning targets. That'll need to get more specific. 2, reading literature standards. And 3, constructions of meaning from, interpretations of, and responses to complex texts. So, and then she goes through each one. Based on student learning identified in 1A, part of developing students' ability to comprehend and make meaning from text relative to learning target 1 is to provide students with more practice with putting academic vocabulary in their own words. Again, remember we had that weakness where kids were having a problem putting it in their own words. And by providing opportunities to use academic language in the context of their writing. Based on my analysis of student language use in 3A, students tend to have an easier time talking about vocabulary and incorporating it into their writing. Because my students are still developing writers, they need additional practice integrating academic language into their writing to demonstrate content understanding of learning target 1. And so again, this is what went wrong with learning target 1 basically. This is what I'm going to do about it. As we go through, right, I can give more examples, and then I would go on to my next learning targets, right? But again, statements, talking about specific students, coming up with a concrete plan. Great idea. More examples here that you can read on your own. More examples here. And then finally we get to the whole idea of making sure you back up things with theory. For every one of these suggestions, there should be some kind of research-based justification. So in question 2, 14 of 29 students were approaching the standard because they did not use the specific academic language to support their character analysis. I will provide academic language instruction to elevate the quality of student responses to the text. Again, this is the problem. This is what I'm going to do about it. And this is why my plan makes sense. I will scaffold this instruction to support all learners using multiple modalities. Nagy states intensive instruction is necessary if teachers want students to learn words to the point of ownership. Such instruction must provide multiple types of information about words, provide multiple instructional encounters with each word, and include activities that require mental effort and creativity from students. So again, this idea that I'm going to make a recommendation, this is why I'm going to do it the way I'm going to do it. Kind of how we've talked about it since we've been talking about planning. So that's it for the teacher assessment skills. There is a assessment skills quiz that I'd like you to take. Next week we're going to be grading some stuff and looking at some actual patterns that exist within the data that I give you. So that'll be kind of fun. It's way more fun when we do it in class. People usually have a somewhat enjoyable time. At least that's what they tell me. Could be lying. Have a great week, and if you have any questions, let me know.